Welcome. Welcome to Virtually Poly Pandemic Edition. This is going to be about tips for ongoing digital communication, some comparative history, and forward-looking thoughts on post-pandemic polyamory. My name is Stacey Capps. I'm the Vice President of Open Love NY. It's a not-for-profit group that provides support and education to the polyamorous community in New York City. I'm also a bit of an expert on digital audio and video communication. I have a bachelor's degree in digital media studies from the University of Denver, over 20 years of experience in the field, and about a dozen certifications like Zoom integration, Slack administration, Crestron networked conference room control, Avixa CTS, and so forth. You get the idea. But today I'm also going to talk about things that I'm interested in, but I'm not necessarily an expert. For example, I'm going to use comparative history to talk about where we are versus the pandemic that is a century ago, and then use that to help make some educated guesses about where we may be going next. And along those lines, I'm also going to be looking at macroeconomics because I think that may have an impact on our future. Finally, I'm going to be sharing some stories of how this pandemic has gone for individual polyamorous people. I did reach out to friends and acquaintances along the way to making this presentation, but I'm not sure anyone knows the full extent of how all our lives have gone. In any case, I'm only going to be sharing the stories of people who've already chosen to post their private information online. Anyway, to start, we are going to do what everyone in my industry does, and we're going to share my screen. So this is the presentation, but we're actually going to start with a video today because a year after my first presentation for Open Love on this kind of topic, we're all hoping that we're near the end of it. And this is what that was, Saturday Night Live featuring Bad Bunny from late February. I love that. It covers a few of the things we are going to talk about, actually. But what I want to do first is, again, talk about these personal stories of individual poly people. Because I said a year ago, hang on to your hats, folks, it's going to get weird. I was worried that polyamorous people who might live nearby their significant others would have to shelter away from them. And without enough digital communication tools, those relationships could be at risk. Oh, this poor lady, Shelley Baker. I lost both my polyamorous relationships to other people during the pandemic. Rough times. So here we have someone living with her boyfriend. Her boyfriend has another girlfriend outside the home, and she has a second boyfriend outside the home. And everything is going great, but then the pandemic hits and it's time to make those really hard decisions. So the choice that they made was that the girlfriend would actually move in with the existing couple, and the boyfriend would have to kind of be without because pandemics are hard, the extra boyfriend. And what's happened over a period of time to Shelley Baker is this new girl who moved in was getting along better in this household than she does with someone she'd been with for a long time. So she ended up kind of being broken up with and leaving her former home, and meanwhile along the way also breaking up with her other boyfriend. So despite starting out with all those ducks in a row, she ended up single. So that's one of the misconceptions about polyamory. People assume that you must be in multiple relationships if you describe yourself as polyamorous, but to some people it's more like an orientation, and whatever your personal life might look like at the time, whether you're single or have one partner or many partners, polyamorous might just be part of who you are. So one on the left, my partner broke up with me by text and I never replied. This is a bit heartbreaking. So here we have a couple that actually lived in different cities and would see each other as often as they could, and it was going great before the pandemic. But for the guy in particular, touch was his personal love language. So without the ability to give his partner a hug or get a kiss or at least a little pat on the back now and then, it just got harder and harder to maintain that connection until eventually he just sent a text message that said, I just can't do this anymore. And that's tough, but also kind of understandable. And how easy or hard that is to repair later will remain to be seen. I guess. On the right, here's a happier story. Forming a three-way relationship during lockdown changed my idea of love. So here's someone who did not expect to end up in a 3% household, but that's what happened, and everyone's very happy. So great for them. I will say, a year ago, when Dan Savage said polyamory is canceled, all of the polyamorous people who are living in homes with multiple, adults, 3 or more, kind of shook their heads like, what is he talking about? We're doing just fine in our little bubble. Anyway, these are a couple of stories that are not specifically about polyamory, but they're going to affect everyone. And I think our community in particular tends to intersect with other communities in ways that make these stories interesting. On the left, I spent my life consenting to touch I didn't want. This is from New York Times, they both are. And on the left, you have someone who's actually a dominatrix. And when the pandemic hit, she narrowed it down to a single client for obvious reasons. But she also spent a lot of time by herself and had a new ability to reflect on everything from early teenage experiences, her own dating history, her experiences in the workplace, and then even with clients in situations where she was theoretically in charge, but also being paid. She may have some reevaluation to do and maybe thinking about things a little differently when all this is over. On the right, how do I define my gender if no one is watching me? Without a public eye, who are we? And there are absolutely has been more questioning of gender norms, but in addition, people's personal understanding of their own gender. And some of it occurred quite naturally due to just the strange logistics of the pandemic. Men can no longer go to their barber, and when their hair grew long, maybe they liked it. The women no longer had to wear short skirts and high heels to get along at the office because they were working from home. And on Zoom, you're only seen from the waist up, so they could wear lovely, comfortable yoga pants. And now they dread going back to the office and having to wear what they used to. And maybe they simply won't. Maybe some norms will change. No doubt there will be some people we see in the future who surprise us with the way they present or with how hesitant they will be to touch one another. And we have to be considerate that they may have had some reflection time during this pandemic, and we may all come out of this a little different. So. Some useful concepts to ponder. As I was researching this, I came across terms that I picked up that I thought were interesting and useful, and I just want to share them with you before we get into nitty gritty so that you have them in your mind. The first on the left is what I call pandemic adjacent. So this whole period of time we've been living with together has brought some things into view that were hidden but present before. So grief of disenfranchisement. This is about those socially constructed moments where we mark the milestones of our life and the grief that can take place when we're not allowed to participate in those touchstones the way people normally would. So for example, someone who was ill could not be visited by their relatives in the hospital. And then even funerals were in some cases scaled down or not even held at all, which makes it so much harder for the people who are left to mourn, the ones who have passed. But it's also something that you see with positive life events, marriages, certainly large marriages with a lot of guests were simply not possible in the same way or not wise in any case. So there were a number of people who got their marriage certificates but put off having any sort of public celebration indefinitely, which doesn't feel the same. And similarly, kids graduating, whether it's from high school, college, or whatever after, they couldn't have those graduation ceremonies they love to have to really celebrate this changing time in their life. And so maybe it feels a little bit less like that change is here for them. It's been a tough year. And I want to take a moment to be considerate that there have often been people, for instance, gay marriage was not possible when I was younger, who have also had this sort of grief of disenfranchisement. It's always been there. So also compassion fatigue. This is the very difficult situation where you've experienced so much loss and the people around you have experienced so much loss that it's become hard to muster the same kind of empathy and kindness that you would like to, or that you would normally be able to provide. This has been especially hard when, for instance, COVID-19 works its way through a family, or in the case of polyamorous people, your partner, your partner's partner, and their partner, if it ripples out, it just becomes so hard to deal with the difficult news and to provide the support to one another that we need. Imagine how hard it can be to lose someone and the only person who understands what you're going through is their other partner. Totally happens. So communication debt, another one. And this is about, especially with digital communications, sort of social media and group chats are where we see it most often. The idea is someone sends them out a message to a group, and theoretically, multiple people should reply, but everyone is busy, they're fatigued, they're in this sort of brain fog of the pandemic and nobody responds, just like that Saturday Night Live video. That totally happens. And the funny thing is you can actually cause yourself just as much anxiety because you feel like you should be getting back to people and you haven't. So whether you do or don't respond can feel like there's just no way to win on that one. And I want to talk about attention economy, but we'll go with doom scrolling first. Doom scrolling now in the dictionary after such a short period of time. It's when you are checking the news or your social media feed, kind of looking for bad news or expecting bad news and just wanting to be on top of it almost compulsively. That's doom scrolling. And why that has been so important for some people is because of this concept of the attention economy. Just as you only have so much compassion in your heart that you can give at any one given moment, in the same way, you only have so much attention to provide to all the things in your life that might want it. Not just your social media feed or your news feed, but you also only have so much attention for your job, for your family, for your friends, for your partners. And if you are not paying close attention to where that energy is going, then you may not be spending it in ways that really match your personal values. So next up is information inequality. And we've seen how important this can actually be. The difference between an old person with dial-up access who doesn't understand the internet and a young kid with, fiber lines running to their house who, knows how to use all the apps. Who do you think is going to get a COVID vaccination first? I mean, there's really no question. In New York, we actually had the city send out tablets to kids who might be at risk of falling behind when school moves to like online only participation. So here's an irony. Some of those kids were in homeless shelters that did not have any kind of internet access. So they've got these tablets and no way to get their homework or information on it. So how difficult must that be? So information inequality has some real world consequences for people's lives. And I'm all in favor of trying to even that playing field a little more. So the last one, here's where we start to get cheeky, is masquerading, using the word M-A-S-K, mask. So this is about people who will swear up and down that they have taken all the correct pandemic restrictions seriously, and they would like to meet you, but of course you will stay 6 feet apart, only in the open air, and everyone will have masks on, it'll be great. But when you meet in person, they'd like to give you a hug. Surely that's okay. Maybe we can take the masks off. Gosh, they're awful thirsty. And, an hour later, they'd like to give you a kiss. And it just feels like, wow, that's not what you signed up for. So there's sort of masquerading. They're telling you what they think you want to hear. But in the end, actions always tell you the truth. And I do feel like there's masquerading in real life that may or may not have to do with actual masks. And it's something that people need to look out for. So non-monogamy adjacent over on the right. Here's another funny one, but this is a keeper. It's sneakyarchy, like sneaky, but we're making a pun on the term hierarchy, which is one form of polyamory that's, useful and respected. And the idea is you select one or more relationships that you consider your primary relationships, and then you're allowed to date or even form other bonds outside that, but they might be more restricted in whatever way makes sense for the primary group. So it might be two people together or a triad together, and maybe they share finances or are raising children. They have obligations together. And then those they may date outside that group, there would be more restrictions as to what can and can't happen, how much time can be spent together, that kind of thing, so that there's never an inability to meet the responsibilities that you have together. Some people prefer that method of polyamory. Others prefer another type of method. There's solo polyamory, where you consider yourself your own primary partner, and a relationship anarchy, where you view all relationships as having their own natural point of progression, and there should be no restrictions to reach that. Maybe you don't even differentiate as much between the importance of a romantic relationship versus friendship or versus a familial bond. So finally, sneakyarchy comes along when someone enters the dating pool and they meet someone that they know would prefer a non-hierarchical form of polyamory. They're more of a free spirit or an egalitarian. And while you know you have a primary situation in your life, you know they don't want to be secondary, so you tell them what they want to hear. Problem is, when the pandemic hit, the chips really fell, and it was quite clear where people stood, because some people were able to shelter together and see each other, and others simply were not. So in some cases, people who thought they were on an even keel with their partners found out the hard way that there was actually a hidden hierarchy that they were unaware of. Now, to be fair, not every situation where someone felt left out necessarily had to do with sneakyarchy. You absolutely had situations where there's only so much room in a place and nobody can afford to move, and it seems just scary to do that right away. So these are not easy decisions to make, to be fair, but sneakyarchy is a term I expect to continue seeing to kind of describe the situation where, in most cases, an existing couple is opening up their relationship and they paint an overly optimistic and rosy picture of what they can offer to other potential partners. So next is parallel relationships. And I'm seeing this more on mainstream dating sites or in people who are having conversations who don't really know anything about non-monogamy of any variety. And they're using this term to describe what happens when you're using dating apps and you're sending out multiple queries, because who knows who will respond, and responses don't come in any sort of, strict timely manner. So you can end up dating multiple people, even if that was not your intention. And as long as there's no reason to close that off, people can just continue doing it. And as long as there's general honesty about what's going on, no details need be exchanged necessarily, as long as there's some basic understanding about safety and everyone's being kind, you end up with these parallel relationships. And that seems to be becoming more common, especially among younger people who have not settled down, I guess. So arguably both. This means these terms have been pandemic related, but also have a non-monogamy calling to them. So the first is pandemic pods or quarantines, or I've heard them called bubbles. The idea that you have a select number of people that you are fairly free with, and then everyone else you take much stricter precautions with. You always wear masks, you stay at a distance, you meet outdoors. But within your pod or bubble or team, you can be a lot more free because you've minimized risk amongst yourselves. So the funny thing is, if you use those kinds of terminology to explain polyamory to people, they seem to catch on to it a lot faster because they actually have some real world experience of how that might work. So they don't ask as many silly questions about sexually transmitted infections, for example, because they have an idea in their head of how risk might be mitigated. So next is flu bonding, which is a pun on fluid bonding, another polyamory term. We love to make these up. So flu bonding is the COVID-19 version of deciding exactly with whom you want to loosen your restrictions. Although this is implying sexual contact. Fluid bonding is about, the transmission of bodily fluids between people who have taken careful precautions to minimize their risk and to keep minimizing it by taking more precautions with other potential partners. Fluid bonding has, in some cases, meant something about a sort of closeness or bonding, and other people just don't necessarily feel that way about it. It's just a practical matter. But if fluid bonding was a thing before, it became flu bonding for a little while as well. So quickly want to recap last year's report before we go forward. So if you flash back to a year ago, I talked about how polyamory has spread in the modern era. And this is largely due to the ability to disseminate information about it online. If you're in a library, you might not think to look for a polyamory section, but you may come across it in a dating site, wonder what the heck that is, and it's super easy to look it up. And in addition, if you find you're curious about it, you can pop onto social media, find a group, ask some questions about it. And in that dating app, you can filter for only people who are interested in it, if that's what you want to do. This is certainly a level of access and understanding that was not available when I was a much younger person. So some polyamorous people are early adopters of online communication technology. It's not just me. There are others like me. And part of that is because we prize communication. And for example, we often need to coordinate schedules. Coordinating with one other person is hard. If you're also sharing childcare duties, it gets harder. Now try with multiple adults and all their different schedules, and the fact that polyamorous people tend to be quite busy in other ways. And it gets really difficult. So you have to learn how to do that in a way that works for everyone, can be updated anywhere, anytime, and the right people will get the memo without you having to send a bunch of messages each time. So in addition, polyamorous partners are more likely to live apart, whether that means just in a different apartment or house in the same city, but they may also live a long distance away, sometimes across the globe from one another. It's not unusual. And it's partly because you're not expecting that one person who will provide all of your needs for you. So therefore, if they're gone for a couple of months, that's just unlivable because your needs aren't being filled. In polyamory, you can get your needs, some from here, some from there, and over time that can change and shift. And so you can be open to forms of relationships that otherwise might just feel too difficult. So this is all things I talked about. And then I was like, but what does that have to do with the pandemic? And what are we going to do now? And I said, well, okay, here's the thing. We need to remain connected to the people we love. That's going to be important for us. And here I worked with Loving Without Boundaries. It's a great website and podcast, and love it. If you want to go look it up, it's great. 50 ways to connect with your lover. It's still out there. Even after the pandemic, you might want to read this list because some of these things are genuinely fun and interesting. So, and I also provided some real, actual ideas and examples of tools and how to best use them. On the left, we have a Zoom window, which I'm using to record this presentation right now. And I was showing people how on a laptop or computer, you can right-click on that white bar at the top. And there is this keep on top function. Now you can change the size of the window, move it anywhere on your screen, and whatever you do, it'll stay up there where you can see the other participants. You can also minimize the window and it'll make this little box in the corner. You can change from speaker view, where you're just looking at one or two people, to gallery view, where you've got that Brady Bunch style list of folks. And down at the bottom, so important, you can hit that camera button anytime and stop your video, and that's absolutely okay to do. This is what I was kind of telling people, because I knew that this pandemic was going to be more than a couple of months and we were all going to get tired of Zoom. So on the right, I was demonstrating Google Calendar, which is a bit of a mainstay at this point in the polyamorous community. I was explaining how you can create a shared calendar. Either you can just share your calendar that you already have with the people you care about by sticking their email address and giving them access, or you can set up a separate calendar, and anyone in your group can add or subtract from that calendar. You can even use like different colored entries to kind of show, you know, this is this person's event, this is that person's event. We're using purple for birthdays and so forth. Or one cool feature that we do use in the polyamorous community is privacy settings. So instead of giving a partner every little detail about, you know, the online address of the meeting you're attending and the phone number of a person you're meeting and all these little details they don't need, you can just say, look, I'm busy. And they know when they can schedule a date with you, but they don't have to know why you're not available exactly on other evenings, right? Finally, here we are a year later, and Zoom fatigue is painfully real. I got a lot of questions, understandably, when I was preparing this. And I love this Wired magazine. They now have sort of a Dear Abby column for cloud computing that is very fun. And this article, "Why Can't I Stop Staring at My Own Face on Zoom?" is pretty funny. It gets almost existential. But the important thing to know is that it is not just you. If you keep staring at your own face instead of paying attention to the meeting, that's actually pretty normal. It's called mirror anxiety. And here's a funny factoid for you. Women actually look in the mirror less per day than men. And the reason is, when they look in the mirror, they tend to criticize themselves, whereas men tend to kind of give themselves mental compliments when they look in the mirror, so they do it more often. And this is the case even though women spend more time on grooming per average than men. So it's no surprise that this also impacts the experience people have had while they're actually using Zoom. So in addition to that problem, and which is solvable, there's the issue of having excessive amounts of close-up eye contact. So if you are looking at especially a large screen with somebody's face blown up full size and they're looking at you, it might feel that they are too close for comfort. In the animal kingdom, if somebody stares at you from nearby, you have every reason to believe they either want to attack you or mate with you. And both of those just feel inappropriate and unnecessary and weird when you're doing a Zoom call with them. And yet that's the way our systems are currently set up to operate. Something that I suspect we will get better at, both in terms of technology and our ability to adapt to the medium. So next, video chats can dramatically reduce our mobility. A lot of people stop using hand gestures when they're on a video call because they feel like they have to be in that little box. And in the same way, they are afraid to get up and walk around, where in their own office or next to their desk, they might get up and pace to think. They might feel free to take a minute to go to the bathroom during a meeting and come back. With a video call, somehow we've got this assumption that some people have that you just have to pay attention, and that it'll be strange if you don't, no matter how long the video call is or how much it does or doesn't have to do with you personally. So that's tough. And it's just not natural. We actually lose our focus when we don't allow ourselves to move around. So finally, the cognitive load is much higher for video chats. And earlier I talked about information inequality, and I want to point out that it's something that matters here too. The experience of two people with high quality video connection is so much better than when one or both people, for whatever reason, has latency, dropped frames, the audio is cutting in and out. It seems like they're looking at a series of photographs instead of a moving image. All of those things, even 1 second of delay between when somebody says something and when their lips move, is super confusing to our brain that's used to processing things in real time. We tend to mirror each other's expressions and body language, and there's a certain kind of empathy that goes on. We're mirroring people in order to put ourselves in their head and understand what they're saying and how they're feeling. And the harder it is to process what's going on the other side, even if it's just background noise coming from outside their window, but you can't see the window on the screen, so you can't figure out where the sound is coming from. Like, all of that makes the cognitive load so much higher for video chats. So all this comes from a study by the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab. Props to them for doing this excellent work. And they have suggested some solutions, which I will share. So I was so right a year ago. Look at me. Take Zoom out of full screen mode. This, again, especially true if you have a laptop or a computer and you're dealing with a large screen. You can reduce or minimize the size of your Zoom window. And I highly recommend it, especially when you're on a lot of Zoom calls per day or you're in a particularly long one. 2 hours or more is just kind of grueling. So next, use the hide self view button once you see that your face is framed properly in the video. Almost all major video apps, Microsoft Teams and Google Meet and so forth, will let you turn off your own video now, whether it's through the video settings of the device or whether you can literally just click on that or right click on that image and tell it to go away. It's going to reduce anxiety and so, in some cases help you concentrate on the actual content of what you're trying to look at. Next, if you want to avoid the stress of exposing your local environment, use blurred or virtual backgrounds. So here I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second so that you can concentrate on me, and I'm going to just mention something quickly. I would like to really bring home just how much your background makes a difference. So right now I'm using a fairly standardish Northern Lights moving video. And here is what my background actually looks like. So this actually tells you some stuff about me. It tells you I like plants, that I have a green screen, which with my job makes sense. The really geeky people might even recognize the map of Faerun behind me. That would tell you that I play Dungeons and Dragons. I run a game, actually. So social signaling can be something that will help you bond with other people, or it can have the opposite effect. So this is a hotel room in Paris. When you look at it, you might imagine trying to sit in one of those chairs and how uncomfortable some people would feel. But by the same token, this is a mock-up of a 150-year-old apartment, of Moore's family kitchen from about 150 years ago. It's like homey and nice. And if you're not comfortable in an upper class place, maybe this would feel better. But also keep in mind, there's this nostalgia for the past that's super thick in this environment that also might make people uncomfortable. And I'll use one last one. That's from my D&D game. I've got one that's kind of an amusing little, subway stops skateboard phenomenon, kind of a moving video. And people in New York City love this, and people in rural areas find this uncomfortable. So it just goes to show that you want to keep your audience in mind. No one virtual background works for everybody, and not everybody wants to share their real life. If you have a messy home with kids running around and a dog that likes to jump up on your lap and distract everybody, maybe you don't want to use this, but you can use blur feature in most, not all programs, but even Zoom added it. There's a nice little blur so that the people on the other end will concentrate on you instead of this stuff. So going back to my normal, and we're going to go back to sharing my screen. So you can use that blur or that virtual background, but pay attention to what you're doing and why. Meanwhile, you can also add personal space by increasing your distance to the screen. So if you got a laptop in particular, they often have these little tiny pinhole cameras at the top. And depending on how you have to keep the screen so that you can read the words clearly, you might be, somebody's looking up your nose or down from above, and it's just awkward, right? So purchasing an external keyboard allows you to type naturally, but also still put that camera far enough away and the image of the other person far enough away so they no longer feel threatening to you. If you have a smartphone device, maybe what you want to do is invest in a pair of wireless headset. You can get them for real cheap these days, I swear. You don't have to get anything fancy. And, get a little plastic stand to put it on so you don't have to hold it in your hand, which gets, heavy and uncomfortable if you're doing it for long enough. Finally, it's okay to turn video off periodically, stretch, pace, and give yourself an audio-only break. I've been known to literally take this headset and it auto mutes when I flip it up. So I can listen in and I can, I can easily enough do what I like. But last thing here, I have my own recommendations for Zoom calls. Great, right? On personal calls, in particular, I want everyone to assume that there is mutual permission to move around freely and live your life. While you're talking, you can cook, you can clean, you can do your laundry, you can take out the trash as long as your signal works out there. Wireless access is pretty common. If you don't have it, you can get it easily enough. And feel free to live your life. Get up and pace if you like. Stretch in your chair. It's fine. And we all need to kind of chill out about this concept of taking video calls even more seriously than we would sitting in a boardroom for a conference, right? You can also turn off your video after the first 5 minutes. This is especially true when reviewing content like this presentation, but it could be something else. A couple people playing video games together don't need each other's video on their screen all the time necessarily. Then they don't have to worry about those weird faces they make in the game when something happens. Similarly, a group of friends watching movies together, no need to keep that video up all the time. Turn it off and then, turn it back on at the end of the movie when you discuss what you saw. So next up, employers should consider Zoom-free Fridays to be the digital equivalent of casual Fridays. And I would just say video-free Fridays, maybe. But we're used to the idea of casual Fridays, increasingly common even in fairly conservative workplaces, and especially in the warmer months of the year. Dressing casually allows you to leave work and immediately go socialize with your friends and not have to worry about going home and changing or just feeling like your uncomfortable employed self in what should be a freer social space. In the same ways, when we're going into that weekend, we want to conserve some of this emotional energy, some of the social energy that we have so that we can spend it on doing the things that aren't directly work related. It also allows us to use those Fridays to, close up our work week and feel like we can leave it behind us and actually pay attention to the rest of our lives instead of feeling like work is a constantly always on scenario. So even if it's just Friday afternoons, kind of cutting off the meetings or at least making the video free, I think really does help people. So finally, reduce the length of calls when it makes sense. Some scheduling systems now allow you to book a 20-minute call or 45-minute call, etc. The important thing is by giving yourself 10 or 15 minutes between these video calls, you give yourself the opportunity to go get that cup of coffee that you need, to answer that email or that social message, so you don't feel like the tasks you need to complete are piling up as you go from, video call to video call, and then you feel overwhelmed and exhausted at the end of it all. Highly recommend those shorter meeting times. And then this one is for polyamorous people in particular. I recommend, I know this is a lot, but set aside time to spend only with yourself. And I don't care if it's technology free or not, though some people swear by quietly reading a book or, hanging out with their pets. Other people are going to say what they really need is to get on a video game and get immersed in that otherworldly environment, or just, meditate, write in a diary, The important thing is that you have time to be yourself without necessarily considering yourself as being in the context of a larger social group. You need to know who you are, and you need to have a strong feeling of what your identities are so you can be sure that the time you are spending with others is a time that you want to spend, that you feel is best for you. So, those sadly valid predictions from a year ago. I had the feeling this would happen. The work-home balance became harder, and this is particularly true for people with children, whether they were younger kids who could no longer go to daycare, or older kids who were stuck homeschooling, um, and teenagers who were missing that, social difficulty and training that everyone must go through at that age because everyone's online. Man, it was tough. It was a tough year. And to the extent that there's some inequality in which genders are expected to be responsible for this extra work, that stuff became super clear. What might feel fair when one partner is working from home near the kids and the other one is going to the office every day and coming home late, maybe that stops feeling so fair when both partners are working from home. Uh, Needless to say, there has been tension in many a relationship. Privacy issues have also become more pronounced, and polyamorous people are not immune to that. It can feel like one thing to schedule outside dates where you leave the home with someone else, and otherwise, maybe you don't message that person a lot, or if you do, you're able to do it discreetly here and there. And your living partner is not necessarily interested in that and not burdened by information about what you're doing. Now it can feel different when you are in close quarters all the time. In some cases, too close quarters, because now you've got one or two or more offices in the home. And that means less space between you and your partner, so that when that text message pops up from another partner, they can look over at your phone and they see it too. Sometimes even the image that was sent, the exact words that were used, and maybe that is too much information. So you can go into those phone settings and increase your privacy app by app if you have to, or do it across the device that it'll give you a notification and not tell you exactly what was said, or any images that were sent until that phone is unlocked. So along with the depression and anxiety you would expect from so many people being isolated, drug and alcohol use increased even more than I expected, and especially by women, and women with children in particular. Man, it's been a tough year for them. And we have to show some sympathy, but we also have to recognize that the hard economic choices they've had to make have been impactful for sure. And also, unfortunately, domestic violence has increased. Now, the economy explains this in part. When people lose their job or it becomes very difficult to pay bills, this causes tension in the home. This is well understood. But the amount of increase in domestic violence isn't entirely explained by that alone. There are these other factors listed above that are also causing tension. And not surprising if you see all the rest of this, divorce has increased. And my honest expectation is that it will continue to as we head out of the pandemic, as it becomes safer for people to move, for example, as people get jobs, go back to the workforce, and they can afford to live apart or seek a roommate in a way that they don't feel able to right now. As the kids go back to school, there are a bunch of reasons why the existing tensions may come to a falling out for some folks in the end. In any case, hard decisions about who to shelter with, man, those had really oversized effects on polyamorous relationships. It's been a good year, it's been a bad year. So what is next? Here's where we go to that historical comparison, and we're going to start by reviewing what's already happened and what happened a long time ago. So in 1918, we have what was called then the Spanish flu. Now, it didn't start in Spain. There were other countries that happened to be fighting World War I where it was seen first, but Spain was a little less directly involved in that war. And so they were the first to openly talk about this terrible pandemic sweeping the globe. And for that reason, they got marked as the Spanish flu originators. So I just like to call it the 1918 flu. In any case, one image here is from the Library of Congress on the left. On the right, the grief crisis is coming. And appended to this little article is a video from Esther Perel. She's an excellent psychotherapist who mostly has dealt with romantic relationships, intimacy, and mostly among monogamous couples. But her books are called Mating in Captivity and The State of Affairs, and I would call them polyamorous friendly, to say the least. But she had some interesting and useful things to say about the pandemic, and here we go.
At some point, probably every single one of us will know at least one person who died from coronavirus. I have been in self-imposed isolation with my husband. We are part of the at-risk population. I think we are, many of us, experiencing a deep sense of anxiety. It's not just about the physical death. I think it's also the death or the loss of the world that we've known, the loss of a sense of predictable future. Life is lived in the details. So when people mourn or grieve or experience losses, and they say, I had this trip planned, I had this talk planned, I had this date planned, you don't know the meaning behind the event. One person just says it was a date, and you think, oh, a date. But behind that date may be years of loneliness that we're finally, hopefully, maybe going to change. And it's that what people are mourning. They're not just mourning the event. They're experiencing the grief over what that event meant or means for them. There's one more grief. It's the loss of touch. I mean, you know, there's this video on social that is just gone all over the world with this father and his little son is running over to him. No. The father is telling him, don't touch. People's history with loss, with anxiety, with fears, with grief, with unresolved mourning, all of that comes to the surface. I have a son who started school was 9/11 and he finishes with the last semester of coronavirus. And he wanted to go to New York City. And I'm thinking, this is trauma coming back. I am a child of 2 Holocaust survivor parents who are the sole survivors of their entire family. I kind of got trauma with mother's milk. I actually am the perfect person for denial because I often feel that I live in a state of what is called in my jargon, counterphobic, meaning I'm so terrified that I sometimes live as if I'm fearless. But everyone saw that image of those trucks in the back of the hospitals in New York City. This is where we are putting the bodies. This is terrifying. I don't want to be that body. I look here in the small towns in upstate New York, the cemeteries are literally in the villages. They're all over. Death was part of the living. And we have moved death further away. We try to prolong life at all costs. We avoid death. And suddenly it is much closer to us. We are seeing it, we are smelling it, we are anticipating it, and we are fearing our own and that of our fellow citizens. That sense of loss that we currently have. You can't help the person who is sick. You can't say goodbye to the ones that are in the hospital and that may not come out. I have written a lot about eroticism, but not in the narrow sense of sexuality. I speak about eroticism as life force, as aliveness, vitality, vibrancy. That power that functions as an antidote to death or deadness. It's okay for people to talk about other things, to laugh, to actually laugh out loud with some of the videos that are circulating that are just so funny. The one with the guy who puts oil on the floor and he's pretending that he's on a Stairmaster. And there is one with the guy who's dancing salsa, but with his hand on the mirror as if he's holding his companion. There is laughter in hell is one of the things my father always used to say. It gives you distance, it gives you perspective, it gives you a sense that you're not completely at the mercy of. It's okay to laugh. I am the more anxious one amongst me and my husband, and on occasion he'll just come up with a good joke, and it's such a relief. We have a 35th wedding anniversary this week, and we decided we would dress up and have a date, and have dinner in our kitchen. It is still okay to celebrate in the middle of grief.
Okay, so good stuff, right? But it wasn't that different back then either. We had a lot of the same issues for sure. So one thing I like to do whenever I'm running across history, I come across a polyamorous group people don't have awareness of, I just like to point it out. So here's one from that era, the 1918 flu. In London around that time, there were a group of people, they called themselves the Bloomsbury Group. Some of their parents knew each other through a religious organization. Others, they brought in their partners, their friends, and occasionally someone would meet someone outside the circle who had similar views. They'd bring them in. And when the pandemic hit, they decided, well, by golly, they're going to live within a few blocks of each other. And they would have, group dinners together. One household would cook and others would come to eat and talk. And none of these folks were particularly famous before they started having these conversations and collaborating. We have authors Virginia Woolf and E.M. Forster, painters Vanessa Bell, Roger Fry, and Duncan Grant, and economist John Maynard Keynes, who's still studied for his views on macroeconomics today. He did some good predictions back then too. So all interesting folks, and they were unabashedly feminist, very interested in making sure that women could vote someday, and they were unusually accepting of queerness. There were gay couples, there were people with same-sex relationships or crushes, and it was all just accepted as being part of life, which was very unusual at that time. And it was quite normal if you were living with a partner or married to them, there was no reason for that to limit you. So that's the Bloomsbury Group. They didn't have the internet, but they figured it out. So did technology change communication around then? Of course it did. This was a time of great technological change. The upper class could see this change as early as 1910. And then for the rest of folks, it took until 1930 for some of these technologies to become widely available. Good example was the car. So car is short for carriage, and the earliest cars were made to look sort of like horse carriages without the horse. So they would have a fabric covering on top. You'd have a sort of driver's seat in the front, and then in the back, you'd have two sets of passenger seats facing each other, just like you would a stagecoach. So those people would be the upper class, people being ferried around, having their conversation, and the driver would be, a servant, an employee doing that work. Then the problem would happen when inevitably one of those upper class car owners decided they wanted to drive it themselves. So they'd be driving along and their compatriots would be having a conversation behind them, and it would be hard to hear because the engine was loud, there are no windows. So they inevitably turn their head to have that conversation, lose track of where they're going, and go headfirst into a pole or a tree or a bicycle rider. And it was thought that cars were extremely dangerous and were unlikely to get better because of communication problems, partly. So another good one, so telephones were invented, but they didn't have phone numbers. Instead, they would use switchboards. So you would pick up the phone and the phone operator would know because, your port had lit up that you wanted to talk to them. Then they would ask you who you wanted to be connected to, and they would look for that person on their switchboard, put a physical wire connection in place, and voila, you would be talking to the other party. So because that's how it worked, the switchboard operators also had the ability to connect themselves to you and listen in on that phone conversation without you necessarily being aware of it. And since switchboards operators were often located near the people they were serving, they could listen in and gossip about people in their area in a way that felt like a total invasion of privacy. as you can imagine. So the initial solution was to create regional switchboard centers. So only a tiny fraction of the calls you got might be from your neighborhood. The huge majority are for people in places that you're not interested in. And it just kind of changed the nature of the job and the sort of people who were looking for that job. And in the end, of course, we assigned everyone phone numbers. We put the buttons on the phone so we could get those numbers and put them in ourselves. And the whole business of human intervention was eliminated through automation. Another interesting factoid, elevators kind of thing around then, and they required elevator operators too. So they were often quite small. So you get in an elevator, maybe another person would get in with you, and they didn't have the social moxie to know to kind of face the door. So what they would do is face each other, and meanwhile there would be this elevator operator also looking in your general direction. And that guy was like the phone switch operator, only in your building. The likelihood that he would gossip was even more high. So people would just be staring at each other's eyes for a very long elevator ride up because they were slower then and not saying anything. So awkward. They actually will tell you now that staring into someone's eyes while close to them for a couple of minutes can form an intimate bond without even talking to them. So just feels super weird to do that with potential strangers, right? So look, it takes time to figure out what works, and you know what, that's okay. It has to be. We always figure this stuff out in the end. So if we want to compare 1918 flu versus the pandemic, you know, it's important because understanding the similarities and differences can help us understand how well the past is going to predict the future. So here's some similarities. Arguments back then also raged about government requirements for things like restricting large gatherings and wearing masks. Interesting story, World War I was ended not long after the pandemic started. And so everybody wanted to have the usual military parades to welcome home those fellows coming back from overseas. In New York City, they canceled their parade. There was a lot of anger about it at the time. In Philadelphia, they went ahead and held it. And 100 years later, the Motor Museum actually held a centennial parade to mark the 100-year anniversary and named all the people who had died, probably as a result of that actual parade, people who died shortly after that time. So it became a super spreader event for them. Tough times. Also similar back then, a significant percent of carriers showed no symptoms. So there are people walking around infecting others, and they had no reason to know that they were infectious because they didn't even know they were ill. We know that's true for at least 20% of people that have COVID now. And it's unclear back then how often it occurred because they had no way to test for the disease. But we know it happened. Social unrest was also a big issue back then. And then as now, it had to do with immigration and race relations. Back then, of course, we were well after the Civil War, but we were at that period of time where Black Americans were moving north away from the formerly plantation-run states towards those that were more run by modern factories. And that put them in competition with people for jobs. Luckily, there were a decent number of jobs available as time went by, but on any given day, having a lot of people moving into your neighborhood causes a little tension. And then as now, it was called the Spanish flu. And there were people who were targeted in some parts of the country, but not others, simply because they looked Spanish. More often than not, they were actually Italians who had recently moved to the country, and people didn't know the difference. Most of the Asian Americans attacked for the Chinese flu, I hate that as well, are not from China, you know. So in any case, last thing I want to mention is that back then there was an increase in lower and middle class people who were newly learning how to wager on the stock market. So there was a time when if you wanted to, you know, bet on the stock market, you needed to have a brokerage account, and you couldn't do that unless you already had a good number of assets available to you. Like they wouldn't even open an account for you. So your average everyday guy couldn't do that. His best bet was to try and put equity into a home. But that all changed and new brokerage houses opened that were more available to the public, and eventually word got around. And because it was a piece of paper that represented a company someone believed in, presumably, there was this assumption that that certificate, that stock certificate, would maintain its value in good times, bad. And as we all know today, the stock market is a little more fickle than that. So some differences between now and then. So back then, the 1918 flu, it was particularly a problem for military personnel, which became a problem when they came home, but it seemed to favor people 40 and under. So young people, working age people, children still in school. It was particularly deadly for those under 5 years of age. Whereas COVID-19 seems to be less of an issue for our children, thank goodness, than for our adults, and our elderly are especially impacted and have been the first to be vaccinated as a result. I would also point out that COVID has been particularly hard on those people who are already medically underserved in our nation. So here in New York City, there were hospitals closed in the Bronx and Queens and minority neighborhoods. And sure enough, those communities are having a harder time with COVID now, and not just for that reason, but that certainly does not help. Similarly, there are parts of the country that are just rural. It's just a long drive to the nearest hospital, and it wasn't always that way. If you look back at the last 30 years, a lot of hospitals have closed in less populated areas. And finally, I want to talk about the prison population. These are people who are forced to stay in close quarters with one another. And while the guards were often amongst the first vaccinated, depending on the state where these regulations and decisions and policies were made, the actual prisoners might have been vaccinated towards the end. So while a similar total number of deaths are anticipated, it's important to point out that the population in the United States back then was 4 times larger than now. So while it might be the same number of people, like the math, the number is the same. On a per person basis, the number of folks that you would know was much higher back then who had gotten very sick or even died back in those days. So it had more of a personal impact, more even than now. So final big difference is obviously medicine's changed a lot since then. They didn't even have antibiotics in 1918, and the flu for the vaccination only came out in 1945. So nurses were considered the most effective response. They could give you liquids and keep you resting and try to help you keep your temperature down, things like that. Whereas the doctors didn't necessarily have good medical treatments to provide. Where these days, it's the scientists who have won with their fancy RNA vaccines, among other things. They've come out with vaccines within a year available to all adults in the United States, and children coming, certainly 12 and over by the end of the summer, I'd imagine, should be largely vaccinated, and below that, probably a fall or perhaps winter, depending on how the trials come out. So way big difference now versus then. So here's my concern though. While it may look like it's going great in the United States with over half of adults vaccinated as I record this presentation, that initial vaccine inoculation may not be enough. Keep in mind, while it may be great in Europe and the Americas, it's a far different story when you look at India. Even though they make a lot of vaccines, they don't necessarily have the ability to make this one for various reasons, some of which are logistical, but others are purely legal and have to do with patents. And Africa and South America, Latin America, there are whole continents that are not well vaccinated, and it doesn't immediately look like that's going to change. So here's the problem. As long as there are a large number of people who are not vaccinated, that becomes like a little petri dish for mutations. These many generations, even in each individual person, occur before this before this disease runs its course. You multiply that by billions of people, it'd be almost troubling if there were no major mutations. And along the way, we can expect to see versions that transmit more easily. We could also get unlucky and find that one of those also targets the young in the same way the Spanish flu did way back in the day. Yeah, tough times. So I really don't want that to happen. And that means we need to globalize this vaccine effort ASAP. And we have some initiatives that look like they may go in that direction. I'm super in support of them. We need to ramp up production globally because we may end up needing annual booster shots, just like we do for the flu vaccine that we have now. If that's true, then we need billions of doses every year for however long it takes to kill this thing for good. So, for each loss in the pandemic, 9 will mourn. What a tough year. And we can see how tough it was in 1918 too. But here's the saddest part. We're looking at the 2020 spike, and 2021 is also going to have a spike in it. How high remains to be seen and depends on how well we vaccinate ourselves. But one thing that will occur regardless is we will continue to have these patients, 1 in 3 with long COVID. So they get the disease, they may not even experience many symptoms during the disease itself, on occasion, none at all. But then over the following weeks, they develop symptoms like chronic fatigue, brain fog. They lose their sense of smell and it feels permanent, and that can cause them to lose their appetite. And then there are other symptoms that some people experience and others don't, but long COVID can be debilitating and it's very real. Interestingly, people with long COVID who take the vaccine may see an immediate improvement in some symptoms, but not others. And it may well be that even after the disease is cured, the body needs to heal. The sense of smell, for instance, may take a while to return. So why is it important that we track what's different and what's the same? Because of what happened last time. So the good news is that the 1918 flu led to the Roaring 20s. So remember that young people had just ended a world war, that they just went through a far worse pandemic than anything in their immediate history books. And so many young people had died that it was really making a dent in the population of the country as a whole. And the ones who were left, man, they wanted to celebrate that they were still alive, because who knows what life will throw at you next. But right now, today, you're here. And in that time, celebration often meant alcohol. But then, as now, the pandemic caused a spike in alcoholism, and women became much more political than they had used to be. Domestic violence was a problem then too, but the ability to leave your partner, especially to divorce, was just not the same because women weren't working the way they are now. So yeah, there was an attempt to give women the vote, but also to pass laws to, make it harder, at least, for alcoholics to continue doing what they were doing. So one of the problems with prohibition is that it wasn't uniformly passed, wasn't the same everywhere. Here in the United States, it could vary not only from state to state, but from county to county. In some places, it was, bars were closed, but you could get your booze in, an alcohol store every day but Sunday, perhaps. In another place, it might be the case that hard liquor and beer is no longer available, but they've left a little loophole for wine. And in other places, no alcohol at all ever, never want to see it, super legal. So because of this, there was going to be an underground trade in getting alcohol from the places where it was technically legal to the places where it wasn't. And in particular, you also saw these speakeasies being opened. So you have a normal looking establishment in the front and an establishment serving alcohol secretly in the back. In the East Village, I lived near a hot dog shop that actually you could go through a phone booth in the back and there was your speakeasy. It's still around today. The thing survived over 100 years. Amazing. But because of that, you walk into that speakeasy, there is a sense that your ability to receive the same legal benefits may not be the same, because you'd have to admit you're there in the first place, and that means you're also going to be in trouble with the law. So that caused some issues. But on the upper hand, we had all this new cool technology that consumers could get, and it was really making their lives a lot easier and more interesting. So we have the combustion engine, which wasn't just cars, but it also modernized factories and made a lot of goods cheaper, and electricity and all the appliances that you could now have in the home as a result. So there were improvements behind this that were made on a government level. There was the electricity infrastructure run to rural areas. There were improvements in highways. In the 1920s, car prices dropped by 3/4. So all of a sudden, more people could afford them, and they could travel to other cities that way. And to help them do that, there were all sorts of new forms of consumer credit. For the first time, you could buy in installments, whether it was a fancy new dress or a new car, or maybe something useful like a sewing machine or a refrigerator that might theoretically pay for itself over time. But as people found out, if your ability to pay those installments stops, all your previous investment might go out the window as your goods get reclaimed and taken away from you. So it wasn't all as rosy as they had hoped it would be, I suppose. During that time, the working population fell, as we discussed, and so bargaining power grew, and some industries found it easier, therefore, to unionize. It was not so easy if everyone in a factory floor sat down for the company to just go find somebody outside and pay them instead. There were just not a whole lot of people without jobs to start with, much less people willing to kind of break the line on an existing strike. So every industry that organized saw wages go up by roughly a third, and this had an overall positive effect on everyone's wages, even outside those industries eventually, because everyone's competing with everybody for the talent of tomorrow, right? So this combination of having these new consumer goods, plentiful jobs, even in rural areas, and stock market access, and all these cheap goods, wow, it just led to this great sense of euphoria. And we see some correlations today. For example, we are seeing the legalization of marijuana, but it's different in different jurisdictions. In one place, you can only get it if you have a medical prescription. In another place, maybe up to a certain amount, and then beyond that limit, you go to jail, just like in the old days. And in some places, it's pretty open and free, and the cops just have better things to do than smell what might be in your car, for example. So we also see some similarities to the electrical project of the old days with broadband internet today. If we want to solve that information inequality, that really does mean laying lines to everyone and making sure that there's enough competition in the market for everyone to afford the service. I also see some super potential in business-led AI, which we'll talk more about a little bit later. Artificial intelligence has the potential to change how we do things in ways that are pretty interesting and are going to be impactful. I'd also point to augmented reality as something I'm not expecting to see tomorrow, but we're looking at a whole decade ahead. Yeah, there's a good chance that augmented reality, so this is like a virtual reality, but with an overlay of computerized information, boy, that could change us just as much as the smartphone did when I was younger. So I will be looking for those things, but also I'm looking for an increase to the federal minimum wage, which will make pretty big changes in some parts of the country. Also, if unionization starts to become more successful, that's going to pique my interest. And also, if we see unpredictable stock market fluctuations, people might remember the GameStop scenario that happened through a Reddit group of all things, and mostly young and new investors using apps like E-Trade and Robinhood that, again, were not available to our parents. But also we can look at things like NFTs, long story if you don't know what that is, or how about digital currency like Bitcoin or Ethereum. These things are not backed by governments like regular currency, and yet their valuation keeps going up. I'm keeping an eye on wild fluctuations and potentially the collapse of one or more of these currencies in the future. So be careful what you wish for, said Aesop way back in 260 BC. That guy knew his stuff, man. Because what ended the 1920s was the 1929 stock market crash. This is an image from The Great Gatsby, pretty decent film, great novel. And the Roaring Twenties were followed by the greatest stock market crash. It was global in nature, and it went on for years. And there were so many people in the food lines, so many people homeless, living in Central Park in New York City, for example. And it's just hard to even fathom the scale of that suffering, even after just having gone through our own pandemic. That's what I worry about, really. So let's not go there. If we can help it. It arguably only ended when World War II came around, and so many war materials were needed for those being sent off to war that it changed the economy and turned things around. So another major difference, not only is medicine much better, but everything is online now in a way that was super not the case 100 years ago. This is something I pointed out in my last presentation, and I put this together using a number of sources listed at the bottom because I love being a right man. I can't fault myself on this one. I said, everybody needs to start playing video games because everyone's going to do it. And by the end of this year, I suspect 2/3 of Americans will be playing them on a regular enough basis for it to make even more impact to sales than is already the case. Whether it's just mobile games on your phone or people buying whole consoles and picking up stuff for their PCs, it's been a good year for that stuff for a lot of reasons, and also really good for video streaming subscriptions. I talked last time about Hulu Party and Netflix Party, and now there's also Amazon Prime Party, where you can share movies with your friends and you're all watching it at the same time. Now we've got your HBO Max and Disney Plus and Paramount TV, these newcomers, sort of newcomers to the field, who are actually showing what would have been box office hits to the digital audience first, because those box office locations as theaters are currently still closed. So you can see how that's tanked, but also sports and performing arts just aren't pulling in anywhere near the revenue that they used to, and for totally understandable reasons. Good news for people who are interested in sports and the live performing arts. Back in the day, they had like the best baseball season ever after the pandemic ended, and Broadway bounced back so strong because there were so many great properties that had been waiting through the pandemic for everything to reopen, that when it all came out again, it was dazzling. So that will recover. In the end, we may actually find we are spending a little more money and time on these entertainment experiences than we used to. Maybe that's fine, right? So I do want to point out, in particular, online multiplayer games have scratched otherwise unmet social itches, and that's been good for us in various ways. On the right, I have this modern love column, love it. Feeling lonely, wearing cat ears may help. This is actually a story from before the pandemic, but it was released after it, and you can feel why. It's about a couple who met through Final Fantasy Online, and then one moved across the country to be with the other. I've been seeing stories like this for at least 15 years that I can recall, and I can only imagine that it happened more during the pandemic. On the left, we want to do a shout out to Among Us. So this is a game where you collect a team of people, and most of you are there to complete tasks together and have a successful, space flight or whatever the map tells you to do. But one or more of you is designated by the program as a traitor, a secret traitor. You can attempt to sabotage the others or even literally stab them in the back. And if you kill enough of them, you win. Meanwhile, the rest of the players, if they can figure out who you are and send the bad guys out the space lock, then they win. So in this picture, I've put a polyamorous person on the far right. We play these games too. And that's the little poly flag on their head. But obviously, they're not the traitor because that's the guy on the left with bloodstains on his white overalls. Is that dude? Yeah. So I discussed last time how communication platforms were evolving, and I expected them to evolve even harder because so much of our lives were going to go online. Super happened. Glad to say I called it pretty well with Zoom and Discord. I want to point out right now that I think Clubhouse is going to be real, but we'll see, right? what's happening is they're all in a war where they're trying to add features and create larger and larger groups of people who can communicate with each other. They're going to give those old timers like Facebook a run for their money, these new guys, right? So, but I want to point out the downside of these quick evolutions. I like Signal and it's super secure, but not all of these apps are like that. Discord and Slack in particular were targeted by people who like sending viruses and malware. So people would trust links and files from these platforms because they seem to be large enough and legit enough and everyone's using them. But it isn't necessarily true that just because a company is large, that it necessarily protects its customers well. So the good news is Slack has responded quickly. They upped their institution of file scans. They allow corporate players to now only allow other people from the corporation to send files, not someone from outside. And the frequency of malware reports to Slack has dropped dramatically just in a short period of time. But Discord hasn't responded in the same way. They say they do scan files, but they have no expectation of changing exactly how that scan works. And the number of reports is only growing and getting worse. So behind that is an interesting story. We believe that Microsoft may be in talks to acquire Discord. Now, if they do, they have the ability to institute their file scanning, which they use for applications like Teams and Office Online, into the Discord platform, and that solves a lot of problems really easily. In fact, what happened a few years ago is Microsoft bought Skype. Remember that? It was kind of an alternative to FaceTime before all these other video apps grew big. And they developed Skype for Business, at which point Microsoft got super interested in them. They bought out Skype, and now Skype for Business will be eliminated by the end of summer. You have to migrate to Teams unless you actually have a Skype for Business server, which is a rare case, and I wouldn't recommend keeping it around forever because security needs are always evolving. That server is never going to change again, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if regular consumer Skype shuffles everyone into Teams as well, because Microsoft instituted that Skype technology into their new products, and then they didn't need the old stuff anymore. Similarly, they may do the same stuff with Discord, which has proven excellent at helping people develop group communication platforms. So groups of gamers who want to team up and play different video games in groups of 4 to 6, or even larger groups up to 20, or podcast people who want to create a community around their subject of interest and invite people in to converse with them about those topics on a regular basis. You know, Discord is pretty good at it. Its actual video delivery is so-so. Its screen sharing is better, but like everyone else, they're improving as quickly as they can. But we don't know what will happen if Microsoft buys Discord. That program may get frozen in time, not so different from Skype, and eventually everybody gets shoved into Teams. We'll see. So here's what I didn't predict. Can't get everything right. And boy, was this a biggie. So there are these internet rabbit holes. They're not just on the conservative side, though that's the most famous, is the QAnon conspiracy. They're on the left as well. You know, chemtrails and vaccine causes autism, super not true, and so on. There's both sides of this, and because we have been socially isolated from our local social networks, I think it has made it easier for people to glob onto these conspiracies and fall down the internet rabbit holes where they're only talking to other people who already agree with them, and they're not looking at information that might tell them otherwise. So on the right, we've got this little cartoon from Tick the Wolf, who's non-binary polyamorous person. She's got a fantastic website slash comic slash book called Kimchi Cuddles. Really great, highly recommend it. But man, it feels like she's speaking from some kind of experience about the dangers of QAnon if you read it. But I want to talk about why that's happening, because that's important too. So it's so important to understand that these social media apps and platforms are not necessarily well regulated by the government, and they are changing so quickly, and they are for-profit companies, so they have an obvious profit motive. In particular, They want to keep people engaged, which means for them a few things. People spend more minutes per day on their platform. They want people to speak, to identify their likes and dislikes. They want them to use emojis so they get a sense as to the people's emotions at the time. And you know what? If people get emotional and argue with each other, that keeps them on the platform. It keeps them engaged. And because they get emotional, they might drop their guard and be more persuadable by something like an advertisement that they might otherwise, have the fortitude to ignore. So they've learned that there is something called confirmation bias. Psychologists like to talk about this thing that changes how we react to purely factual information. If we're fed two news articles that are both completely accurate and equally important, but the difference is has to do with what we already believe about the world. Let's say the first one tells us, it seems to back up what we already believe. It tells us what we want to hear. We're more likely to read the details and then pass it along through our social media feed, tell our friends about it, spread the news. If it's equally factual and important, but it doesn't match with what we believe around the world, maybe it actually contradicts it, we're more likely to dismiss it without even reading it in the first place. So that confirmation bias then feeds into our news as we speak more with like-minded people, but the apps are incentivized to tell us the most upsetting thing on occasion to make sure we stay engaged. So all this engagement is at the expense of our social cohesion, and things are happening online that I don't think would be the same in person. And that may continue to be the case until we get a better idea about how to regulate these platforms for the benefit of all of us. So an interesting thing happened over the last year. I knew that there would be disinformation, particularly about the pandemic. And of course, that was the case. And to make it more difficult, in some cases, it was leading politicians, Bolsonaro in Brazil or Trump in the United States, who, Boris Johnson, briefly, I suppose, in Britain, who were saying things that were just not factually true, but it felt true to them, perhaps at the time. Let me give you an egregious example. At one point, President Trump just kind of ad-libbed that, maybe we should inject a bleach. This is a deadly idea, don't do it. And obviously, the platforms don't want to be responsible for the potential deaths on their hands if somebody actually decides to try this out after seeing a video of President Trump saying this on their social feed. So some disinformation was either blocked entirely or some warnings were put up, put up a warning, make sure people know, hey, this is the truth of the situation. And eventually whole people were blocked. And from the perspective of your conspiracist who, believes that all this stuff about COVID is nonsense, or what have you, whole perspectives are being blocked that feel true. So some of them just left the most dominant social media sites and went elsewhere. Your Facebook person found that all their friends were going to Parler and they went there too. And the thing is, Parler is written by very socially conservative people, so they are less likely to assume that this information is false because of their own biases. And furthermore, because it's a new company that has not received as much scrutiny, they just don't have the employees, the moderators available to really police what everyone is saying for factual accuracy. As it grows larger, it would see the same kind of pressure. And so you could have this cycle where people are always leaving for the least common denominator. And that's troubling to me. So polyamorous people are not immune to this. Don't believe anybody who tells you that it's just a more enlightened way to be. Look, whatever is best for the individual is best for them. There is no one right or wrong way to do relationships. And wow, polyamorous people aren't just not immune to COVID, they're not immune to misinformation either. We're all human. So this is a picture of Ashley Babbitt from her, I believe, Instagram feed. She was a 35-year-old Air Force veteran, and unfortunately, she was shot dead by the police in the Congress building on January 6th. It's known that she was a QAnon believer and a Trump supporter. She co-owned a California company that cleaned people's pools, and employees for that company generally did not wear masks when they went to people's homes. She was in an open marriage. She was living with her husband, who had got married before they met their mutual girlfriend, who was living with them, and they were all in relationship, all three of them with each other, for at least a year before Ashley left. And while her husband expressed some agreement with her political opinions, he deeply wished she had not gone. Of course, he did not want to lose the partner that day. So could this be temporary? Is it possible that when we are all in each other's company again, some sort of social cohesion will reestablish itself? I hope so. And I will say that adjustments in media consumption so far have largely gone as I predicted. And so I'm going to make the earlier prediction that we are going to see a reduction, but not elimination, of people falling down these internet rabbit holes once we all get to see each other again. But there's also something that I really, really hope will change, which during the pandemic, Zoom was the hammer and everything else was the nail, like everything. I do believe after the pandemic, we will decide that some things are better done in person. And I don't just mean going to the office because your employer requires it, or to school because that's required. On the right, we have a little article. I've marked it up myself. Want a divorce? Try a celebrity on Zoom to break the news. It's actually an article about Cameo, the service that you can hire a B-movie actor, musician, etc. And they will either record a video to send to you or to someone else, or they might even do a live video call. And people were doing breakup announcements through celebrities. Many of them will now have on their page that this is not a service they provide. They are not therapists, and it is not reasonable to expect someone else, even for money, to do this work for you. I would still say that whatever medium you are using to communicate with people the most, that is how you are expected to break up with them. And if that's in real life, then so be it. If it's through a Zoom call, so be it. But do it yourself, please. But what we will do is continue to use these video tools in general. We all know how to use them now. And we've determined that they can be more convenient than going out and doing stuff in person at times. So many features are being added. What used to be kind of jokey filters on Facebook Messenger calls, for example, are becoming more standard, even with apps that are used by corporations. Now, often these are tools that can be turned off, but here's a good example with Zoom. If you look in your video settings, you will see a few useful things. Mirror My Video can actually help you with that mirror anxiety you feel just by flipping your image to the other side. It may feel less like you're looking at yourself. Interesting factoid. But more interesting to me, we have the stuff on the bottom where you can touch up your appearance, and it will kind of like smooth out any coloration issues and adjust for low light, which is great if you're in or want to be in a darkened room and still look decent on your call. So on the left, I've used those features. I've turned up touch up my appearance more than I'd recommend. More than half actually is pretty weird. And it's set at about, I think, a third or so on default. On the right, now we really get into it. If you go into backgrounds and you have a new version of Zoom, there's all sorts of stuff hiding there. You'll see the video filters. If you click on that little video filters line next to your virtual background, now not only can you have something fake behind you, but you can have it in front of you. I've put some like text camera looking stuff on the screen. It's a bit cheeky, but I like it. And you can also click the Studio Effects link at the bottom that really few people know about. And you can do stuff like, make your lips look purple or make your eyebrows look different. So in this photo on the right, I'm actually in the same lighting with the same hairstyle and the same lack of makeup. And I have put on a fake mustache and beard so that I can look more like a dude on the cover of a novel, some sort of historical romance. Now, if you think that's hilarious, but you'd spot it from a million miles away, look back at the left one. That daisy in my hair is totally fake. That is a video filter. And I have made my lips darker and my eyebrows darker so that I can be my perfect manic pixie dream girl self. No mascara yet, but I bet it's coming. Just give it time. You can already put stupid hats on yourself if you want. It's gonna keep going, folks. So here's another feature that's pretty neat, and Microsoft was first out with this one. Good for them. They call it scenes, and the idea is instead of having your Brady boxes where people are in a little tiny, squares, and everyone feels segmented and apart from each other, you can use a single virtual background to have it look like everyone is in the same room together. Now, this was originally created with classrooms in mind, expanded almost immediately to like a boardroom, an auditorium looking seating. And then sure enough, we started getting, holiday scenes, jokey underwater backgrounds, things like that. And not to be outdone, like the day before I had this presentation, Zoom immersive view is what they call it. So a year ago, I discussed how you can use speaker view or gallery view, which is the Brady Box style. Now, if you click on that, you've got a third option if you've got a brand new version of Zoom, and it will say immersive view. So this is an immersive view of a fireplace scene outside that only allows for 2 people. So that's an intimate kind of one. When I added a third person to the call, it just stuck me in the box at the top. So these are all me at the same time. We've got my computer in the front, we've got an Android phone on the right, and an Apple phone on the left. And you can kind of see on the bottom how one version of me looks way bigger than the other. That's simply because the camera is closer. And that's what Zoom does with that information. You can totally have this situation of like hobbits on the left and giants on the right. And I think what that does in practice is it encourages people to stay the right distance from the screen so that they can be the same size as the other participants. So it actually has a subtle but useful effect on folks. Remember, camera, eye distance away. Arms distance away, eye height, microphone, inches away from your mouth. Not 1 inch, that's too close, not a foot away, too far, somewhere in between. That's the ideal, mind you. So in the future, we have to get used to hybrid everything. And the word hybrid, I think, is also going to become common. It's just the idea that you can either attend in person or online. That's all it is. And there will be exceptions. So live entertainment is likely to stick to in-person models. You'll go to see the big band concert live, and you'll feel the rumbling of the vibration through the floor and the chairs that way. And similarly with sports, there will still be people who want to get into those hopefully excellent seats where they could see everything. And experiences that include touch are obviously non-negotiable. You can't go to a massage class the same way or experience a mosh pit through the internet. Doesn't work. So everything else, though, working from home days going to become more common. Many jobs will allow it 1 or 2 days a week for more people. And in part, they have learned that they can save costs on real estate if they plan their departments and their seating arrangements carefully around that. There will also be more jobs that are just remote only available in whole regions. And that's going to increase competition for those jobs. There will be snow days that are not really snow days for children. They've already announced that in the New York school year, if it snows, you're expected to join Zoom school again. And it will happen the same way for work. People who have worked from home have worked on average 10 hours more a week. Some of that is them taking their commute time and tunneling into their work. And some of it, I think, maybe just reassuring their bosses that they're really doing what they're supposed to be doing. So all sorts of group meetings and chats outside the workplace, outside the school, are going to start including online video participation where they didn't used to. Meetings about politics, friend groups, even at a bar, you'll just grab your phone and you'll send a group video invite to anybody who couldn't make it in person that night. You'll all have a little talk, and maybe at home you'll grab a beer and you'll join in for a spell. So I think it's good in most ways. We will all be able to spend more time being social with another without having the same commute, without having to leave home. And especially for people with physical challenges for whom going out in person can be much more of a hassle, this is going to be great for them, and I'm happy to see it. On the downside, though, we will find ourselves on camera more often without expecting in advance. We know we didn't go to our friend's party, but we didn't expect a call at 10:30 at night from them, and we're in our pajamas. So should we pick up the call? Let's take a page from Generation Z and say, yes, you should pick up that call. Do it. And if they call you out of the blue, then they get what they get. And that's all going to have to be socially acceptable on your end, right? I mean, within some basic limits. Anyway, this is also going to have a hell of an impact on the dating scene, where meeting in person was the expected first date before the pandemic, and now it is not. So video date introductions have become increasingly common by those people who've continued to try and meet someone during the pandemic, whether polyamorous or not. And there's a couple reasons for this that make total sense when you think it through. From especially from a woman's point of view, we want to feel safe when we're meeting someone in person. And, you know, we don't want to waste our time with someone that can make a good first impression on a website that they spent hours on, but as soon as they open their mouth in real life, it's just a different story. From another point of view, and dudes, I'd say a little more than the gals, it's important to know that your date actually looks like their photos. And though Zoom filters can help you up to a certain point, you can't really lie beyond that with your video call. So it's in everyone's best interest, it seems, to start with a video date. But so far, it's been a mixed bag. So here's an interesting example. Historically, Bumble was originally a feminist response to Tinder. How it worked is this co-founder of Bumble, Whitney Wolfe Herd, she started the company after receiving a payout from Tinder, and that was from a sexual harassment lawsuit. So she created the competition. That's what she did with that money. Bold strategy. And even more bold, with Bumble, women must message first. So this cuts off a major strategy that is super great for a tiny minority of guys and super awful for the huge majority of women. What they do is they message everyone they can, sometimes repeatedly, and sometimes even get rude or aggressive or overly pushy when they don't get a response or when they don't get a good response from these gals. They basically just try to barrel their way into women's lives without really considering the cost. And women don't love that. It makes them less likely to want to use these apps. And on Bumble, they can avoid that strategy entirely, up to a point. So here's the issue. Bumble was the first to institute video calling, at least the first big app. But they didn't institute it the way I thought they would. Once a gal sends the first message to a dude, hey, that guy can immediately video call her back. It is not apparently a problem for him to escalate and for him to make her phone vibrate and a message pop up on her screen that might be interrupting whatever else she is doing, including reviewing the profile of the next dude, right? She has to choose whether to pick up that call, and you can't turn that off entirely. So you can turn off push notifications, you can turn off sound and vibrations. So when you don't have Bumble open, then it doesn't bug you. You can also block individual people. If there's one dude that just keeps calling you, you can block him. But still, that ultimate underlying issue remains, where it feels like escalation can come too much too fast on an app that you would think would be very, hesitant to allow that kind of behavior. Meanwhile, Tinder has this feature, face-to-face, that not everyone seems to be available, not everyone is aware of yet. And it is available in most major cities, increasingly in rural areas, and it's gone global to some extent. It's growing all the time. So how face-to-face works is after you match with someone, you've both shown interest in each other. Now you get a pop-up message that asks you if you'd like to have the ability to video call them. If both sides say yes, now you can click that video call button. And it's pretty easy to turn off too. So, how did that happen? Why did the tables turn? Tinder is now owned by the Match Group. You maybe have heard of Match.com. They also own OkCupid and Hinge. And that group is now run by a CEO who's a lady, a very smart engineer who has a good head on her shoulders, and she seems to be in charge of designing how this feature is going to work. Funny. So in any case, my recommendation for now is even if your dating app allows you to make video calls, do it some other way. You know, connect with somebody through Google Meet, Facebook, Messenger, you know, whatever, right? Use your Zoom calls, use your Teams, whatever, because there's a risk that might evolve. It's not there yet, but give it just a little bit of time. If you think Facebook has too much information on you, and you can kind of see potential for risk with a dating platform, but you know, what do they have? Some information about you and some text messages to and from other people. Now what happens when they can analyze your videos? Well, let's talk about analyzing videos for a minute. I'm going to turn off my screen sharing again so I can show you. What I'm about to do is turn on live transcription, and even in the recording, you will see it. What's going to happen, see, it's working now. What is going to happen is that Zoom's artificial intelligence is going to attempt to translate my words. Now, it's using the same algorithm, not just to translate me, but every other person who uses Zoom. These kind of algorithms, and I don't know about Zoom in particular, to be fair, but these kind of algorithms have overall proven better at transcribing men's voice, better at transcribing white people's voices, better at transcribing young voices. And that's because those are the people who are making these algorithms in the first place, and because there's a lack of testing for other groups. So it's getting better over time, and I expect artificial intelligence to continue to improve, but only to the extent that we hold them to a sense of equity. And it worries me that in some cases, people who are there to carry that torch, who embed themselves in these companies, sometimes they get shut down and shut out. And that's a bad sign, even at Google, shockingly to me. So it's worse than that, right? It's not just a transcription. And I'm going to turn this off because I find it distracting. Yeah, no more transcription. Okay, so they can do more than just know your words, right? There are now artificial intelligence programs. As we know, there's facial recognition. There's also expression recognition. So they know if you're smiling, they know if you're angry, if you're shocked, they know if you're sad. And in the future, dating apps will be able to measure the size of your pupil to know if you're aroused. That's a lot of information about you, wouldn't you say? So there's a limit to how much I want any one company to know about me. And that's why I'm going to stick to video apps that are used for ordinary conversations, not just dating in particular, to hold these video calls with potential dates, because it's less in their financial interest than trying to collect that information. It doesn't do them as much good because they can't tell the difference between a call that's a date or a video introduction and one that is not. Whew, I'm going to put my presentation back on. So that's my concern. Let's move on. While we're talking about dating, polyamorous dating in particular will probably be pretty interesting for a little while after the pandemic restrictions have eased and we're all able to meet each other again. We can date normally again. How great will that be? So there's always like a steady trickle of people who are curious about exploring non-monogamy. And because they haven't been able to explore their curiosity in the same way, once the pandemic ends, there's going to be a backlog of people coming out of the woodworks, I'm pretty sure. Now, as always happens, some of those people will explore the possibilities and will ultimately decide that monogamy is still the best thing for them, and that's great. Other people will find that one part of an existing partnership finds that non-monogamy is exactly what they want, and the other one finds it exactly what they do not want. And those may end up splitting up and going their separate ways and exploring very different lives. This has always gone on to some extent. I just want us to keep it in mind more as we have this large influx of people who are trying this stuff out for the first time. That comes with a certain amount of potential baggage and drama that long-timers should be aware of, and that even the newbies should want to know is potential for them. So in addition, there are gender disparities that grew during the pandemic, and they're not going to shrink immediately, right? So divorce is up. There are more arguments about who's doing the housework, the child labor, and as a result, women are more likely to cause the divorce than men. This has always been the case, but it's even more the case lately. And it's funny because the polyamorous community in particular already suffers from this perception that women have far more dating opportunities than men. And I think that's true for a few reasons. Women seem to be interested in forming fewer bonds that are deeper bonds. Men might be a little more flexible and looking for wider variety. In addition, men are not dating each other as much, or at least not openly. So it's much more socially the norm for women to date one another in the polyamorous community. I say that, but polyamory is really all walks of life, every possible type of person, and certainly the queer community and the gender non-conforming community. These folks are all part of our big cake of everybody. But I'm still going to generalize a little bit, because it is often the woman in an existing monogamous couple who brings up the idea of polyamory. And these gender disparities collect on top of each other. By the time the woman's actually finalized the divorce, she's been ready for it for a long time, and she's ready to date immediately. And she may have been thinking about suggesting polyamory for a while before she actually does it. In any case, again, there's just gonna be this sense that women have more opportunities and that guys are trying to play catch up. That's what I expect. So besides the usual advice I would give you, try a video call first and then meet in person. Here's some other honest recommendations for kind of dealing with this segue into a more normal universe. So those people who are seeking women will need to be reasonably accommodating to them in order to compete. So if that lady wants a video call with you, or some kind of assurance that you are who you say you are, like, help a lady out. Don't take her concerns as being any less than serious and real and necessary. Similarly, those folks who are seeking men that can afford to be a little bit more selective, but they should be aware of getting lulled into a false sense of security of them. My fear is you're on a video call with a dude and he seems so nice, but he's also making a first impression, knowing that if he does, he gets a chance to meet you in person. So if you wouldn't normally meet at the bar downstairs from a guy's apartment, you shouldn't do it just because you had a cool video call with him either. Just treat these people as the strangers that they are, at least until you have met them in person. So next piece of advice, take those poly skills, right? Get them ready, because you're going to need to discuss communication protocols and time availability up front, even before your first date, maybe even before your first video introduction. Hey, what video app do you like to use? Hey, just to let you know, I'm only available on weekends right now. Because you don't know if the other person is an old timer who needs you to send them an email and schedule stuff. You don't know if they're a newbie who expects you to figure out how to use Signal when you've never opened it in your life. And you don't know if they're searching for somebody who they can cohabitate with, or if they're just looking for a summer fling until you ask. And if you got deal breakers in your heart, you better sort that out in advance. So always consider your own personal boundaries, and just consider that you've probably come up with some pretty good negotiating skills over the course of COVID-19 to figure out how and when to meet people, especially as we end this pandemic and we get vaccinated at different days, different times. We're learning how to do what's best for us and the people around us. And that works for this too. So we started all this talking about the year we've been through and how we're looking for something better. And this is another take on it. Again, we're going to switch to a browser so I can show you the actual video, and should be good. Let's give it a shot.
Hey, you must be Matt. Well, I'm Adam, your lockdown relief operator, here to share your post-lockdown life for your pleasure.
Sorry, I'm a little nervous. It's my first time.
Oh, don't you worry. I am oh so gentle. So let's get started, shall we? What flavor of lockdown are we calling from, huh? Are we talking Germany? Is it Italy? Oh, is it Spain, huh?
Scotland?
Oh, wow! Full on lockdown! Wow, all right. We better get started. Okay.
Please, it's been so long. It said on your website that you're not actually currently in the United States.
Yeah, I'm in one of those East Asian countries that quarantined right the first time. Well, I mean, not as right as New Zealand, but hey, at least I'm not the one calling you, am I right?
I heard that they sometimes weld your...
They welded my door so hard.
It's really rough.
Just how I like it. Just kidding. It was actually terrifying because I hedged my bets on not going back to the States. Well, good thing I stuck it out here, though, because check it out. I'm eating dinner.
Go on.
In a restaurant.
Jesus!
Indoors! Ah!
Yeah, that's hot. That's hot, yeah.
Yeah, it's quite hot.
My heart is racing. What are you doing now?
Now I'm leaving to go meet a friend.
For a socially distant outdoor meeting that could be categorized as exercise?
No, I'm at a bar. Check it out.
How many people would you say are there right now?
Like 50. All without social distancing measures in place.
I do still miss going
To a performance? Because check it out. I'm in a stand-up show.
Doorknob's got COVID.
so many people. Aren't you worried you might catch something?
No, man, the only thing I'm worried about catching are feelings. Not even gonna wash my hands. Hello? Oh, that is rude, man. Didn't even let me finish. What the?
Okay, so yeah. Anyway, Scottish accent on that fellow using the laptop, because this is from the social program online from Scotland. They have a good one on ghosting. If you've never heard of ghosting and you're not used to modern dating, you should look that one up too. So the reason I played that last one is to talk about how weird socializing will be at first, because we're not used to it anymore. It's going to feel so strange. And we're going to see each other again after a long absence. So this could be tricky, actually, because our experiences differed so greatly during the pandemic. There were people who got sick who are still sick, people who had loved ones die, other ones who moved to a new home. They worked from home, were relatively unaffected by the virus. And some folks on one side of the political spectrum have had a very different experience than folks on the other side. Some people were more affected by the attacks against Asian Americans, or have different perspectives on the Black Lives Matter movement and all the events that led up to the protests of the summer. So I think it's safe to say that we've been living very different lives, and we're going to have to figure out how to have a social story that we can generally agree with together. So on that point, I want everyone to be able to share their truth, but we want to avoid two things in particular. One is bragging about how good we had it, because that can be very insensitive to people who had it worse. And alternatively, guilting others for doing the wrong thing or failing to do the right thing at what has been a very difficult time for everyone, and one in which, frankly, some people just got misinformation and acted accordingly and might now regret it. This has been tough for them too. So this includes our use of social media. I'm concerned that updates that are posted quite innocently could tempt people who have not been vaccinated to break quarantine, and those people might ultimately get sick and pay the price. So as awesome as it is to be getting back to everything, we might want to wait to share those fantastic experiences in full until a time when we've achieved more as a society and can safely expose at least the huge majority of us to similar events. So when it comes to ourselves, we want to build up our exposure, especially if we have been sheltered at home. We want to start with maybe online activities with others, like watching a movie with friends, playing games with them, or just texting people you haven't in a long time, getting in touch with former coworkers that you would have seen at a bar every now and then and just weren't able to, with groups that you've been affiliated with in the past and you just haven't had cause to reach out to those folks for a while. Even using those social skills is an improvement over nothing, or keeping to that very tiny pandemic bubble, right? And then when you're ready to go out, you can start small and consider an exit strategy, right? So for example, you haven't left your home in 2 weeks, maybe your goal should be to buy a cup of coffee at the local coffee joint. And maybe you're just going to take that coffee and go home, but maybe if you are enjoying yourself and feel good about it, you can drink your coffee at a table by yourself outside, or you could do it inside, or you could get up the nerve to talk to the barista or even another patron. We're getting crazy now, right? So similarly, if you go to a bar, you will probably want to start by drinking in moderation, and moderate more than you normally would, both maybe before the pandemic, but also at home, because alcohol tolerance levels will have changed. Our gut bacteria that process alcohol is affected by the amount we drink. So if someone has stopped social drinking because they're at home, their alcohol tolerance will be lower when they go out for the first time. And somebody who started drinking more may think they know where their tolerance level is, but drinking at home does not involve commuting back to the home afterwards. So they may overestimate and have one drink too many as well. So if you're going out, watch yourself. And if you want to be kind, also watch the people around you and your friends to make sure everyone gets home safely. So keep in mind the vaccinations will be staggered. So it's not going to be one-time introduction and we're all done. This is going to be occurring over many months, probably at least the rest of the year. In particular, I want to point out that adults whose children can't get vaccinated may keep those precautions in place because they need to be a good example for their children, because they fear for their welfare until everyone can be vaccinated. And again, it could take a little while. And finally, some folks are just going to be a little late and slow to the party with vaccination for a number of reasons, ranging from access to the vaccine to having to accommodate themselves to a future where vaccination feels increasingly required. So for some folks that are going out for the first time, whether it's tomorrow or a year from now, physical contact will feel scary to them. Their sense of personal space has expanded to their entire living quarters. And simply, taking public transportation could feel harrowing the first time. And on that note, we want to seek consent for things like hugs and handshakes and pats on the back that we might have just done as a matter of course before. Seeking consent is never wrong, to be fair. But one thing you see in a polyamorous community, if you've ever gone to a convention, you see people who live in other cities from each other rushing up and hugging right away. And for once, after the pandemic, we gotta be more careful, man, because some people are gonna find that super uncomfortable. So we got to expect this epidemic of social awkwardness and social anxiety. We got to forgive people for their stutter, including me. We've got to let them be quiet, let them be a wallflower if that's what feels best for them. They can continue after a few minutes of quiet. And don't beat yourself up over it. And don't beat up others over it either. There's not the time to be the schoolyard bully and try and get somebody to come over and have that one more drink because maybe it'll loosen them up. This is not the time for that strategy, right? This is the time for kindness and empathy. And, once we've all been hanging out together again for a while, then we can get back to our usual hijinks. Yeah. But the first time we see someone, there may be a few shocks in store. Physical appearances will have changed. So some people will have gained weight. Some people, especially those who are ill, will have lost weight. And just in general, the level of musculature with the gyms closed will have gone naturally down. And we talked about some of the differences there may be in how women dress and how men wear their hair. And we just gotta, react well to those changes and with as little shock as possible, if you can. So don't be afraid to give compliments, although keep them genuine always. And where you can, those need to be based on people's actions, not the things that they can't easily control, like their skin looks great because they haven't been outside for a year. We want to talk more about the cool new shirt they didn't used to own that they are now wearing, or the way she has dyed her hair, or just the fact that somebody has been quarantined at home for the last 8 months has finally come out to the bar, and how happy you are to see them. Like, let's concentrate on the things they did, right? And then finally, let's have a tip for icebreakers, because those are extra hard now. Keep in mind that the most fascinating person in the room is often the one who asks the most questions. That will be doubly true now when we are all sharing these different truths and we are searching for meaning in the madness, in the context of finally rejoining our social lives. Don't be afraid to ask people about their experiences, but also keep in mind that some people will not be ready to talk about it, and that's okay for however long it lasts. Don't push, but don't be afraid to ask either. And I will say this, if that's too much, if it's too heavy, you can always ask what somebody has been binging, because pretty much everybody has been watching a show they didn't see before or some movie. I mean, it's been a year. We all have something that we've enjoyed in that time, right? Cartman said 30% of bro ships won't survive the pandemic on Cartman. The pandemic special is not necessarily super funny, but it is insightful. And on the right, I didn't include this as a video, but it's hella funny. This is the 2-2-3 rotation, because the the group of 4 friends had a split up, so dramatic, and then they had to figure out who's going to watch over Kenny, who needs a friend every day, but the rest of them don't want to hang out anymore. So they have this schedule that allows them to figure out who's with Kenny on any given day. And they try like 4 other versions of this, each more ridiculous and complicated than the last, before they go back to this one. Anybody who has dealt with polyamorous scheduling with bunches of adults, or had child custody issues, or especially both, they're going to find this hilarious. Trust me. Anyway, enough of that. What we have to worry about is how to ease that awkwardness when people inevitably start hanging out again together, because life is ready for that. And we can start by reaching out to people now or soon. Friend groups that we're in less touch with, extended family, those outside the small group we communicate with regularly. Here's one, comet partners. For those less familiar with polyamory and our wacky terms, you can think of Halley's Comet, who comes around every, 19 years. And you could have someone come around that rarely as a partner in polyamory. Anything's possible, but usually we're referring more to someone you see every few months or even every couple of years. And the time you spend with them is compact and special, and you cherish it, whether it's a weekend or a couple of months. But then just as quickly as they arrive, again, they are gone, and it's back to the rest of your life. Comet partners swoop in, they're awesome, and then they're gone. And if you have been like most of us during the pandemic and you have a comet partner, you haven't reached out to them, and now you can. Maybe even do it before you're ready to meet them. Because I expect people to travel a lot more during the pandemic. And for the first year after their vaccination, during the pandemic, they will not be traveling. So afterwards, extra traveling. And some people, frankly, have the savings. They haven't been using the time off that they've been accruing. So they're going to go nuts with it. Cruise ships are already super booked, and airlines are almost as busy as they were before the pandemic, even with only half of us vaccinated. So if you're assuming somebody in your area is going to be around, think again, because they may be going for a while. And if you assume that somebody out there is not visiting you or your area, you may want to check on that. You might be wrong. So think of that when you talk to folks like potential comet partners. And then there's metamors. So this is your partner's other partner or partners, right? You can have a whole chain, and then we chain enough people together, we get a complicated little polycule like the Bloomsbury group I showed you. And you may be in regular touch with any number of them, but there are probably others more towards the periphery of your circle, your group, that you just don't communicate with them often because you're not partnered with them. Maybe you don't have as much in common with them. But once social activities reassert themselves and you start moving in those in-person circles again, you're going to run across each other. And it's a good time now, before that happens, to just kind of get in touch, make sure that you meet as cordial friends, at least when the time comes. And finally, Open Love New York. We do accept donations, but also on our website, we're happy to invite folks to our future events, whether they're online or in person. As time goes on, we will adjust accordingly. We'll keep in touch with our members and figure it all out as we go, as one does. But we're even looking for leaders, for folks who can help us with our website, that stuff. It's very real, and I look forward to the future and would love for more people to get in touch with us now or later. So the last thing to worry about is, while we want to reach out to people, we can expect that some % of them will not respond. And we have to assume it's nothing personal, that there's something going on in their life that is causing the lack of response, or even potentially a negative response when we just try to ask them how they're doing. There will be people healing for potentially years and also processing that grief because they had that disenfranchisement where they didn't feel like they had the social support at the time when they really needed it. They may grieve over lost loved ones for quite a while, and that's totally fair. So last one from Kikful Wolf: no individual owes another person a specific type of connection or relationship, especially at the expense of their own safety or their sanity. But we also don't exist in a vacuum. We are part of a community, and we impact each other communally. We owe each other compassion and care and respect. So your healthy balance between self-care and community care, it fluctuates over time. So this is the perfect time to think about, where are you now? Where do you think you might be in 6 months or a year? Where do you want to be? What can you do now that will help you to get there when the time comes? Well, here's one thing you can do. I've got a Band-Aid from my second vaccination shot today, and I highly recommend it to everyone else. Find a way, take the time. I believe that cab service will be available to you at no cost. So if simply getting to the vaccination site is the problem, the government's coming in with a solution shortly. And just in general, I do think there will be more outreach to people who are in those medically underserved areas, especially people in high-risk groups. You know what, as a society, it's in our best interest for us to help each other. The same way we keep our pets safe with their vaccinations, let's keep each other safe as well. So the great news is that poly people were above average at navigating pandemic restrictions. We are so used to dealing with communal risk and finding ways to solve those problems that we just took those skills and applied them to COVID-19. And even more, I saw numerous occasions of us assisting non-monogamous people to make those kind of plans and decisions as well. We can offer them good advice because we're good at it ourselves. And, you know, that's as a whole, it's on average, as always. But I do think that in the future, polyamorous people can be counted on to innovate in unanticipated ways. No matter how technology improves in the future, we'll be at the front of it, and I will be happy to share it with you. Hopefully this will not be my last virtually poly. I'm super excited to keep this dialogue going. After the pandemic's over, I'll still be here. Open Love New York will still be here. And I hope that you will share in the journey with me, whatever comes next. So cheers, thank you for watching this, and have a great day.